I'm Ella Ogden. Today I'll be reflecting on the article Eating Christmas in the Kalahari by anthropologist Richard Lee. The main idea of this article is to show how worldview shapes cultural meaning and how easily ethnocentrism can distort our understanding of other cultures. Through his personal experience with the Kung people of the Kalahari Desert, Lee illustrates how cultural practices that seem rude or ungrateful to outsiders often have deep social purposes within the culture itself. In this article, Lee describes bringing a large ox to the Kung as a generous Christmas gift, expecting appreciation and gratitude. Instead, the community mocked the ox, calling it scrawny and worthless. Initially, Lee felt insulted and confused. From his Western worldview, gift-giving is typically associated with praise and appreciation. However, he later learned that this reaction was intentional and culturally meaningful. The Kung use humility and teasing to prevent arrogance and maintain social equality. This example clearly shows how worldview affects interpretation. What Lee saw as disrespect was actually a cultural mechanism for social balance. One clear ethnocentric bias in the article is Lee's initial assumption that gratitude should be looked at the same across cultures. He judged the Kung's behavior using Western norms, interpreting their reaction as rude rather than asking what it meant within their own cultural context. His worldview led him to believe that generosity should be met with verbal appreciation, which shaped his negative emotional response. Only after reflecting did he recognize that his interpretation was culturally biased and incomplete. This story challenges the idea that one's own cultural values are normal or best. Lee assumed that his way of showing generosity and expecting praise was universal, but the Kung's response revealed that cultures prioritize different values. In this case, humility and community cohesion were more important than individual recognition. This realization emphasizes that cultural norms are not universal truths, but social constructs shaped by environment, history, and values. A unique norm in my own culture is how achievement is often publicly celebrated through awards, praise, or social media recognition. An outsider from a culture that values humility, like the Kung, might see this as boastful or excessive. Based on their worldview, public praise can be interpreted as encouraging arrogance rather than as motivation. This highlights how the same behaviors can be viewed very differently depending on cultural perspective. One of the best practices for effective intercultural communication is to suspend judgment and seek understanding before reacting. Lee eventually did this by asking members of the Kung about their behavior instead of relying on his own assumptions. This allowed him to understand the deeper cultural meaning behind their actions. Approaching intercultural interactions with curiosity rather than evaluation helps prevent misunderstandings and builds respect. I've personally observed cultural misunderstandings in situations where silence was interpreted as disengagement. In some cultures, silence shows respect and thoughtfulness, while in others it may be seen as awkward or disinterested. This mirrors Lee's experience. Both situations show how different worldviews shape expectations about appropriate behavior, leading to misinterpretation when cultural context is ignored. In conclusion, the most significant lesson I gained from this article is that worldview powerfully shapes perception. What we interpret as polite, rude, generous, or strange is not universal. It's deeply rooted in our own cultural framework and lived experiences. Eating Christmas in the Kalahari clearly illustrates how easily well-intentioned actions can be misunderstood when we assume our values are shared by everyone. The author believed generosity would naturally be appreciated, but the Bushmen's cultural norms led them to respond in a way that felt confusing or even hurtful to an outsider. This story challenges the idea that our own cultural practices are normal or best. Instead, it invites us to approach cultural differences with humility and curiosity rather than judgment. One of the most powerful takeaways for me is the importance of slowing down and thinking before reacting, especially when something feels uncomfortable or unexpected. Rather than immediately labeling behavior as wrong or ungrateful, this article encourages us to ask deeper questions, such as, what does this mean in their culture? What values might be guiding this behavior? Recognizing how worldview shapes perception is essential for effective intercultural communication. When we take time to reflect instead of react, we create space for understanding, empathy, and genuine connection. This lesson applies not only to cross-cultural encounters, but also to everyday interactions with peoples whose experiences differ from our own. Ultimately, this article reminds us that true respect comes from listening, learning, and being willing to examine our own assumptions as much as we examine the world around us. Thank you so much for listening. Bye!